Welcome and welcome back, fiber friends, to yet another episode of the Wool to Gold podcast. Today, we are not going to so much be talking about the actual act of spinning, but we are going to be talking about something that goes along with spinning, which is your fiber and how to decide what to do with what fiber. Today, we're specifically going to be focusing in on like the color theory side of things. We're not really going to be talking about like how you decide between using a fine wool or a medium wool or a coarser long wool for a project. We're mostly going to be talking about like how I decide what to do with which hand-dyed braids, essentially. A lot of you have been enjoying a lot of my like how-to and tutorial videos lately, and you've been loving them, but one of the most common questions I get is like, how did you decide to make that yarn a gradient and that one a fractal? What about them made you make that decision? And so I wanted to do just a short little episode where I talk a little bit about what the deciding factors were for a lot of my plans for these braids, and I feel like that will kind of reveal that process to you guys a little bit more. And I do think that this is pretty obvious, but for those of you who are new to spinning, these are not like hard and fast rules at all in the slightest. Any braid can be completely taken apart and put back together in a totally different iteration to better fit what you want to do for a project, right? But if you want to be able to look at a braid and buy the fiber based on knowing what you can, like what the outcome is going to look like and what you're going to do with that braid. Like let's say you are planning to do a sweater project where you need some gradient skeins and you want to buy braids that you can just spin into gradient skeins. You don't want to have to build the gradient yourself. You don't have to take the entire braid apart and blend it up in order to get the results you want. This is going to be the video for you, right? So that you can go into things and you can buy fiber with an accurate idea of what it might end up looking like or what it might look its best as. So how did I decide my plans for these two braids? Because these two braids are really interesting. I do think that both of them hold a lot of potential for a lot of different kinds of projects, and I will talk a little bit about that. But in theory, I do think that both of these, I think a lot of people's gut instinct would be to turn them into fractal yarns, right? And on one hand, I do agree. I agree with this yarn. I think I'm probably going to end up fractal spinning this yarn. I do think it's going to be a 2-ply fractal because I tend to spin 3-ply fractals, and it's just been a while. And I think 2-ply fractals kind of have their own appeal, and they do lend themselves to kind of like, in my opinion, more consistent self-striping effects depending on the way that you do them. Maybe that's a controversial statement. I just feel that way. I feel like there's less to control, right? Because it's only 2 plies instead of 3. But yeah, I do think that a yarn like this, where you already have colors that are pretty muddied together, I do think would make a really beautiful fractal yarn. Now, some would argue that you could probably turn this into a gradient yarn if you spun it like front to back, and then chain ply the entire thing. The thing about that, the argument I would make against that, and also against turning something like this into a self-striping yarn, and again, everybody's preferences are different. So if you're like, well, I know exactly how I would use a yarn like that, or I disagree, like that's totally fine. I'm just talking about my process here today. Okay, for me, the like iterations of color they're not consistent throughout the braid, right? Like you have a little bit of bright blue here, you have some darker blue here, and then you guys can't really tell, but the most of this is like this purple, gray, mauve-y color, and then you have some brown, and then gold, and then a little bit of green. I don't like that, like, you'd have some short, like, very short stripes of these, and then slightly longer stripes of these, and then one big fat stripe, and the color, to me, does not... Because there's like yellow, brown, and green here, as opposed to just going to like from blue to a singular color, to me it doesn't scream consistent gradient. I don't think I would like the effect that would come with this. So because the colors are already kind of like muddied, I just think it would really lend itself to something that would kind of like muddy the colors further. And I think fractals do that really well in a way that also highlights the like pops of color. So I think by turning it into a fractal, it will actually bring out the green and the blue and the gold kind of out against this like darker mauve-y color. And that's why I decided to turn this into a fractal, or at least I have plans to turn this into a fractal. I think this is the next thing I'm going to put on my wheel, if I'm being honest with you. Oh, and my last deciding factor with this is also the fact that a lot of these colors sit pretty closely to each other on the color wheel. They're fairly, what's the word? I had to go and look it up, but the word that I was looking for is analogous. I do feel like that braid has a fairly analogous color scheme, and as a result does lend itself very well to a fractal spin. I do think that like split complementary color schemes and analogous color schemes do make some of the best fractals. Some of my least favorite fractals that I have made personally are when I use complementary color schemes. Those just like, they always come out looking really muddy in a way that I'm not in love with. I've seen some people do some really interesting like kind of trick of the eye illusion color work with yarns like that, but I don't have that capability, and so those types of yarns don't super appeal to me. Now, something like this, where there are a lot of colors that can clash with each other a fair amount, but some of them are a little bit, I don't know, do kind of complement each other very, very well. This one was a tough decision, okay? I think in my heart, I initially thought fractal. Part of me, after my last spin, which I think I'm going to post that video before this one, I'm posting a tutorial video on how to do like a self-striping yarn from a pre-dyed, hand-dyed braid. And I did think about doing a self-striping yarn with something like this, but I just don't really like, I don't know. These colors, like, by themselves completely, I don't know how I don't know. I kind of, the self-striping yarn for this was not calling to me. I think that's just what it was. It just wasn't resonating with me a ton. And so I think that this braid is actually something that I would save for an art yarn project. Possibly this is something that I think would make a great bubble crepe yarn. Okay, because by adding the 2 plies that make that crisscross to kind of give the like bubble crepe effect, specifically in like a black, I think a black would be best, it will make the rest of these colors really pop and kind of highlight them, at least in my opinion. In my mind's eye, I see the yarn, and I think that that would be the best way to highlight the colors and not detract from their individual beauty, if that makes any sense, right? Because again, when you do something like a 2-ply or a 3-ply fractal, or just any kind of like more random spinning as opposed to something like planned and controlled, you run the risk of losing some of the vibrancy of these colors by having them plied next to colors that don't draw out their best, right? And so I just think that something like a bubble crepe, where the center core is kind of just, you know, you can make that the center of attention, and then have some darker plies on the outside to really highlight and accent those colors. I don't know. I just think that that would make that's where my mind is going with something like that, with something like this. And that's what I'm thinking about when I see a braid. These are all factors I'm really thinking about, like, what is that going to be? What kind of yarn is that going to be? Not just the number of plies, not even just like, oh, the basic, like, can it be a fractal or can it be a gradient yarn, but also not leaving out those really interesting art yarns that can become even more interesting when given the right like colorway, in my opinion. If you never watched my tutorials on those art yarns, here they are. Here are examples of them. Okay, this is a bubble crepe yarn. It gets its name because, as you can see, these, like, the bright like core ply is creped in between these thinner outer plies to give it a sort of like bubbly effect. This is one of my favorite skeins of yarn that I've ever spun. I think it's beautiful. I would like to make another bubble crepe sometime really soon. They're a lot of work. They're a lot of work. Just like chain plied yarn, I also think that this yarn just really benefited from the color scheme that was chosen. It's called Raver Cables for obvious reasons, because it is or maybe you can't really see, but it's a cabled yarn. This is a 4-ply yarn. Each of the plies is a different neon color. There's a lime green, a fluorescent pink, a fluorescent yellow, and a fluorescent orange in this. And I just think that both of these, like, they really benefited from the colorways chosen. I don't know, art yarn is kind of, I feel like art yarn and textured yarns are their own category and can really like challenge the way that we think about color or the way that we think about what we're going to do with certain, I don't know, certain hand-dyed braids that we have and things like that. So I just wanted to bring these out as an example, because if some of the yarns that I've been mentioning don't really appeal to you, you're like, I'm here for the weird stuff. I'm also going to talk about that. Speaking of the weird stuff, okay, I think that some of the easiest braids to identify are gradient braids. I have two different examples of what you can get in terms of gradients. You can get a gradient where it is mirrored on both sides, right? So both ends of this is gold. It meets in the middle in this beautiful dark purple. It goes from gold to purple to gold. That's the gradient, okay? But you can also get gradients that don't have like a mirror, aren't mirrored. So on one end of this braid, it's blue, and then it goes into this beautiful jet black, and then it goes into a purple. So it's not the same on each side. It's not mirrored. I feel like it's obvious, right, what those terms mean, but I'm just trying to mention them because I see a lot of people ask the same questions in the comments too, of like my favorite hand dyers and things like that. Like, what's a mirrored braid? What's a non-mirrored braid? These are examples, right? You can turn this into a beautiful gradient skein. Theoretically, you could also, I mean, trying to turn this into a self-striping skein is kind of going to be the same as a gradient. I guess you could technically, if you wanted to do like a 2-ply fractal effect with this as well to get a different kind of self-striping effect, you could. But personally, this is an obvious gradient skein to me, okay? This is just screaming gradient. I am definitely going to turn this into a gradient. Now, when I say gradient yarn, a lot of people think of my most recent tutorial that I did on gradients, where I did a chain plied yarn, and that is well and good. That is absolutely an option. But any time you have a yarn where you are plying against a thread, okay, so thread plied yarns, or one of my favorites, you guys know, boucle yarns, okay, you can use gradients in those as well for that same gradient effect, okay, because when you're plying it against the thread, as the word thread implies, it's very lightweight, it's very thin. A lot of people talk about how when you thread ply yarn, like a lot of the times you barely even see or notice the thread, okay? And this gives you an opportunity to once again highlight and, you know, accent and elevate that gradient effect. I haven't really done a thread plied gradient before just because I don't use a ton of thread plied yarns in my own practice. But I do have kind of an example of like, maybe it's kind of a gradient, not really. It's more of like a self-striping boucle yarn, but I'm going to pull it out for you guys and show you, because as much as I want this video to be out there to kind of like help guide people who really don't know what they're doing, or they're like, okay, I know I want my yarn to look like X. What do I need to buy in the easiest and fastest way to get to X? Like, that's what this video is for. But I also don't want people to get too stuck in the idea of like, oh, I can only do this with this type of fiber, because again, first, just a reminder, sort of as we get towards the end of this video, that all of these could be taken apart completely, and you know, you could do something completely different with them. You could blend them together on a blending board or with a drum carder or with hand carders to get completely different like effects and results and colors and looks. So don't get bogged down if you did already buy a bunch of fiber and you're like, oh, what am I gonna do with all this fiber? I promise you're gonna find something to do with it, okay? Spinners find a way. Okay, so this beaded boucle right here, great example of what I was talking about. First, you can't even tell what color the thread is. Tell me now, what color is the thread on this yarn? If you guess right in the comments, I don't know, you get clout. That's what you get. You get my kudos for having better eyes than me. My point is that you can see that this is kind of a self-made gradient that I did. It is from this forest green to this darker fox red to this bright red with mohair, back into the darker red, back into the forest green, okay? And I applied it to a thread and then applied it again to another thread to create a boucle effect, which is why it has all these really fun, cool textured loops. It also has beads. Because I just can't let things be, I can't let things be cool. I have to make them extra cool. But this is also something that you can do with a gradient type yarn. You can spin it like front to back, just like you would if you were going to chain ply it. But the good option with this is you kind of have the potential, at least in my opinion, to get a little bit more yardage out of it. Because however many yards you spin on your bobbin front to back, when you chain ply a yarn, essentially you're only going to have a third of that yardage in the finished yarn if you're making like a chain plied 3-ply, right? But with the boucle yarn, especially if you don't want as many loops, there's definitely potential to at least get like more like half of the yardage that you spun up. I probably would reckon it's more, especially for the average boucler. As you can see, I go crazy with the loops. I leave no loop unlooped when it comes to boucle yarn. I just like it. I like it extra textured. But again, this is just another option, something else that you can do with a gradient that maintains that gradient effect. You know, when you end up crocheting it up or knitting it up or weaving it up, you will see the gradient work itself up. And that's another thing that you can do with braids like that I think is really fun and really cool and something different. If you're like, I've spun all these gradients, I overbought gradient hand-dyed braids, and now I just have them like sitting around, but I don't want to spin like any more 3-ply chain plied yarns. Like what should I do? I think this is a great option. Again, turning it into like a 2-ply fractal, like a 2-ply self-striping yarn, also a very good option. This is the last braid that I have to talk about today as sort of an example. And I kind of wanted to use this braid first to say, if you made it this far into the video, okay, what would you do with this braid of hand-dyed fiber? Okay, because this one I think is tricky. I don't exactly know what I want to do with this yet. I think originally I was like, I kicked around maybe doing a fractal. I think that's what I said in one of my previous videos. But upon like second looks, like looking at it again, I do feel like there's a little potential here, like to do kind of a self-striping type of thing. Maybe not gradient so much, but self-striping definitely. And then I don't know, I think this yarn could also be super duper pretty as like a marbled yarn. I'm not really sure if that's exactly what the term for this kind of yarn is, where like one side of it is one solid color and then the other side of it is like some sort of dyed fiber. You know, sometimes it's 2 colors, sometimes it's a bunch of different colors. I don't know. I think it always looks super duper pretty. And that's another really fun thing that you can do with really any type of fiber. But I thought that this one could make a really fun marbled yarn. I don't really know it, especially depending on what that other ply is, right? Like sometimes I think traditionally it's like more of a neutral color, like a camel or a oatmeal, sometimes a white or a black or a brown. But theoretically, you could do a lot of solid colors up against like another color. You know, there's a lot of different options there as well as to what you could do with different types of fibers. I think when I first started buying like hand-dyed fiber and fiber in general, I would end up doing or having to like re-prep the fiber or having to do something with the fiber before I could actually spin it or before I wanted to spin it, because I would buy something thinking I could do like X with it, and then I would realize that I couldn't do X with it unless I like, you know, kind of adjusted it or turned it into something else. And so that skill though is really good, because then anytime you buy fiber that like maybe you don't really know what you're going to do with it, or you end up looking at it and you're like, oh, I had plans to do X but that's not going to work out, it's not as like limiting. Like you're not stuck in having to do one singular thing with it. Like who knows, maybe this will end up being blended into some bats or something like that. It won't even end up being like one continuous spin. I think a lot of the times the benefits of hand-dyed fiber is like there's colors that are hard to get in on like a larger scale, and so sometimes you can like buy them in a braid form and just save them for later when you might need them. If you see like a neutral or like a singular colored braid, what's the word, a tonally dyed braid, right? Maybe it's all yellow or it's all blue or it's all green on the braid, you can always like save it and use it for something else later down the line. There's a lot you can do. Again, this video was just sort of highlight like if you have a bunch of hand-dyed braids and you don't really know what you should do with them or how they might look best, I hope that this video guided you in some way, shape, or form. Anyway, thanks so much, as always, fiber friends, for listening to me yap. I do promise I am going to do a shop update so soon, so soon. It's my birthday month. I have to do a shop update this month, okay? But I need to film a video to go along with it. I really need to get photos. Maybe that's what I'll do today. I'll try to take photos of the yarn. And that update will be live by the time that a video here is posted. So if you see me post a video here about a shop drop update and you want to go check it out yourself as soon as you can, go and click on that link. It'll all be updated and all of that fun stuff. Anyway, thanks as always for listening to me talk about yarn and yarn related things. It's always a pleasure, and I hope I see you guys on the next episode of the Wool to Gold podcast.